Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into NATO's secret armies and the rise of covert power in post-war Europe, a topic that's as fascinating as it is unsettling. Let me ask you something. What if the most powerful alliance in the Western world not only prepared for open warfare, but also built underground armies in secret, ready to activate behind enemy lines? What if those armies weren't just for defense, but for something much darker? To understand how this story begins, we have to rewind the clock to the end of World War II. Europe was absolutely shattered. Entire cities reduced to rubble, economies collapsed, and tens of millions of people, displaced, homeless, and desperate, wandered a continent that looked like the aftermath of the apocalypse. Governments had fallen, borders had shifted, and in the midst of that chaos, a power vacuum opened wide across the continent. Enter the Soviet Union. While the West was still counting its dead, the USSR moved quickly, extending its influence across Eastern Europe. One by one, nations fell under communist regimes, backed by Soviet support. This wasn't just military occupation, it was ideological expansion. Moscow wasn't just interested in territory, it wanted to export its vision of a centrally planned, one-party state across the continent. In the eyes of many in the West, it looked like freedom itself was under siege. In response, something major happened. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was born. NATO, a collective defense pact designed to say, if you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. It was more than a military alliance. It was a signal, a wall, an answer to the growing threat of Soviet aggression. But what many don't realize is that NATO wasn't just about armies and tanks and planes. It was also about strategy, and that strategy wasn't always out in the open. The United States, fresh off its wartime role as the arsenal of democracy, led the way in building containment strategies. The Truman Doctrine promised to support any nation resisting communism. The Marshall Plan pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe, not just out of generosity, but to win hearts, minds, and loyalties away from Soviet influence. Economics and ideology were weapons now, just as powerful as any rifle. But even that wasn't enough. Behind the headlines and treaties, NATO and US intelligence agencies began constructing something hidden, something off the books. They created secret resistance networks across Western Europe. These were called stay-behind armies. They were designed to activate if the Soviets ever rolled in, local fighters trained, armed, and ready to resist occupation from within. Sounds like something out of a spy novel, right? But it was very real. And as you'll see in the next slide, it didn't stop at preparation. The deeper you go into this story, the more you begin to question just how far these networks were willing to go, and whether the line between defense and manipulation was quietly erased. Are you ready to go deeper? So let's talk about what happened behind the curtain. While the public image of NATO was clean, professional, and defensive, behind the scenes, something much murkier was taking shape. It started with intelligence coordination. The CIA in America and MI6 in Britain, two of the most powerful spy agencies on the planet, began secretly working together to build a different kind of army. Not tanks and uniforms, but shadow militias, hidden fighters embedded in civilian populations across Western Europe. These were known as stay-behind networks, a name that sounds almost casual, doesn't it? But the concept was anything but. The idea was simple and terrifying. If the Soviet Union ever invaded Western Europe, these units would stay behind enemy lines. They would operate in secret, sabotage infrastructure, collect intelligence, and even engage in guerrilla warfare. And all of this, every bit of it, was being set up in peacetime. Italy's version had a code name, Gladio. Sounds cool, right? Almost like a spy movie. But what's less cool is how widespread this really was. France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, each had their own stay-behind operations. Different names, different teams, but all connected by the same hidden web of Western intelligence. These were not official government forces. They weren't accountable to parliaments. In many cases, even national leaders had no idea these forces existed. Now, here's where it starts to get especially chilling. These secret armies weren't just training in safe houses or waiting quietly in the countryside. They were being supplied. All across Europe, weapons were stashed in forests, barns, and basements. Entire arsenals of explosives, guns, and radio equipment were buried in case of war. But here's the thing, many of these caches were hidden without any oversight from national governments, which means a handful of spies, and sometimes private citizens, had access to military-grade tools with no accountability. What could possibly go wrong? Even more controversial was the recruitment strategy. These networks often turned to people with experience in war. And where do you find hardened anti-communist fighters in post-war Europe? Unfortunately, many of them were former fascists. That's right. men who had fought for or supported authoritarian regimes during World War II were quietly brought into these new anti-communist militias. These were not the kinds of people you'd want holding the keys to a secret army, but to the intelligence agencies, they were useful. They were ideologically aligned, ruthless, and ready to fight. This raises massive ethical questions. Is it ever justifiable to arm and empower former fascists in the name of defending democracy? And who decides where the line is between strategy and danger? But here's the kicker. These operations functioned almost entirely in secret. There was little to no democratic oversight, no debates in parliament, no public accountability. These stay-behind networks were answers to what-if scenarios. What if the Soviets invaded, but they were created in the shadows, bypassing the very democratic values they claimed to protect? So now we have underground armies, hidden weapons, recruited extremists, all operating outside the law. The goal, they said, was defense. But what happens when that infrastructure gets used for something else? Up next, we explore how resistance turned into repression, and how those secret networks may have crossed a line few ever expected. Now, here's where things take a darker turn. Up to this point, you might have been thinking, okay, maybe these stay-behind networks were morally murky, maybe even risky, but they were just contingency plans, right? Meant to protect Europe if the Soviets rolled in? Well, that's the story we were told. But by the 1980s, new cracks began to show, and behind those cracks was something far more disturbing. Let's start with a single event, one that shocked the world. In 1980, a bomb ripped through Bologna's central train station in Italy. 85 people were killed, over 200 injured. It was one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in post-war Europe. In the chaos, the blame was placed squarely on left-wing extremists. Newspapers ran with it. Politicians condemned it. Public outrage surged. But years later, investigations began to tell a very different story. Testimonies surfaced. Declassified documents were leaked, and some began to suggest that this was not the work of the political left, but of state-backed actors, operatives with ties to the very stay-behind networks we just talked about. And if that's true, it would mean this was not just terrorism, it was a false flag. Let's pause and really unpack that. A false flag operation is when one group carries out an attack but makes it look like their enemy did it, in order to discredit them or justify a crackdown. In this case, the theory was that right-wing elements within Gladio, or other Western intelligence-linked groups, had staged the attack and framed communists in order to manipulate public perception. That brings us to something known as the strategy of tension. This isn't just some phrase cooked up by conspiracy theorists. It's a documented concept. The idea is simple: create just enough chaos, just enough fear, that the public demands stronger government control. Law and order, security at any cost. You see? In a time of peace, people get comfortable with freedom. But when bombs go off, when lives are lost, suddenly, surveillance doesn't seem so bad. Suddenly, military presence in the streets feels reassuring. And the thing is, this wasn't isolated to Italy. Similar accusations began to surface across Western Europe. Belgium, France, Germany, Turkey. Patterns emerged. Terror attacks blamed on the left, but with trails that sometimes pointed in the opposite direction. It started to look like there was a pan-European system in place. And that system, instead of simply waiting to resist Soviet occupation, may have actively manipulated democratic societies from within. Now take a moment to think about what that means. If public fear was intentionally provoked, if citizens were deceived into giving up freedoms in the name of safety, then the entire idea of democracy starts to unravel. That's not defense. That's control. That's power being weaponized through silence, secrecy, and plausible deniability. And that's why this next phase of the story is so important. Because eventually, the secrecy cracked, and what came spilling out would force parliaments, prime ministers, and the public to finally confront what had been hiding in the shadows for decades. Up next, the Gladio exposure. So how do you expose a secret army that was never supposed to exist? Well, it happened almost by accident. But when the truth finally surfaced, it hit like a political earthquake. The year was 1990. Italy's prime minister at the time, Giulio Andreotti, stood before parliament and made a stunning admission. He confirmed the existence of Operation Gladio. Let me repeat that. The head of the Italian government openly admitted that there had been a secret, NATO-linked paramilitary force operating in the country for decades, entirely off the books. Just imagine that. One day, your government says everything is under control. The next day, they admit there's been a hidden army operating in the shadows, trained, armed, and ready, without your knowledge or consent. The Italian public erupted. There was outrage, disbelief, and a rush of questions. Who knew? Who gave the orders? What exactly had Gladio done? And had it been involved in any of the violence or terror of recent decades? People began to connect the dots, and they didn't like what they were seeing. Protests broke out. Activists and journalists dug deeper, and across Europe, lawmakers demanded answers. It wasn't just an Italian problem anymore. After all, Gladio wasn't limited to Italy. Similar networks existed in other NATO countries. If Gladio was real, what about its counterparts in France, in Germany, in Belgium? The European Parliament took action. In an unprecedented move, it issued a formal resolution condemning these secret armies. They called for full investigations. They demanded accountability. They asked, very reasonably, why democratic governments were kept in the dark about paramilitary operations on their own soil. But here's the twist. NATO and the United States didn't offer much in response. Despite the political pressure, they stayed quiet. No detailed disclosures, no clear explanation of how deep this network went, no real accountability. NATO, the very organization tasked with defending democracy, offered no transparency about an operation that had clearly bypassed democratic oversight for decades. And that silence only deepened the unease. Because now the question wasn't just what happened, it was what else don't we know? What other operations are still buried in classified files, invisible to the very people they affect? This moment laid bare a fundamental conflict, the collision between democracy and secrecy. You see, democracy relies on trust, on openness, on public institutions that are accountable to the people. But covert networks like Gladio operate in the dark. They are built on denial, hidden motives, and layers of secrecy. And when those two worlds collide, the fallout is more than political. It's moral. It forces us to ask, how much power should unelected agencies hold? Who watches the watchers? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when tools built to protect us are used without our consent? In the next slide, we're going to unpack those moral questions. Because the consequences of Gladio didn't end with its exposure. In many ways, they were just beginning. By now, you might be wondering, how could something like this even happen? How could secret armies operate in democratic countries for decades, not just preparing for war, but possibly manipulating society, politics, and public opinion with almost no oversight? Well, this slide is where we wrestle with the fallout. Let's begin with the most unsettling idea of all, political violence fueled, not by enemies of the state, but by the very networks claiming to defend it. The purpose of Gladio was to resist communist invasion, but in the process, it may have enabled something far more dangerous, the use of terror as a political tool. Instead of deterring extremism, these covert forces may have escalated fear, intentionally. Imagine the implications: public terror events, not as spontaneous attacks, but as deliberate catalysts to shift opinion or justify surveillance. And that brings us to what we might call the paradox of protection. Because let's face it, you can't claim to protect democracy while bypassing democracy. You can't defend liberty by secretly trampling it. Yet, that's exactly the contradiction Gladio reveals. In attempting to secure Europe from external threats, Western intelligence agencies created an internal one, an apparatus with the power to act without consent, without transparency, and without limits. And once trust in public institutions is broken, it's hard to rebuild. Now, here's something you may not know. The tactics used in Gladio didn't stay in Europe. Similar strategies appeared in Cold War operations across Latin America. Ever heard of Operation Condor? A coordinated campaign of political repression and assassination across the Southern Cone. The fingerprints, covert networks, anti-communist rhetoric, plausible deniability are disturbingly familiar. This is what we mean by global parallels. It wasn't just one rogue strategy, it was a pattern, and that pattern had consequences. One of the most dangerous was what we call the blowback effect. When covert operations spin out of control, the damage isn't limited to their original targets. They often erode civil liberties, increase public cynicism, and fuel conspiracy, not because people are paranoid, but because sometimes they're right. Trust dies in silence, and once the public begins to believe that their government lies, that it hides, manipulates, or deceives, the democratic fabric begins to fray. Finally, we have to talk about accountability, because all of this raises urgent questions that still matter today. Who holds intelligence agencies responsible when they go too far? Who investigates the investigators? In the wake of Gladio's exposure, some whistleblowers stepped forward. Investigators demanded answers, but full transparency never came, and without it, many of the most serious questions remain unanswered. This slide isn't just about what happened, it's about what it means. When secrecy becomes standard, democracy becomes fragile. When violence is justified by fear, liberty becomes conditional. And when citizens are told to simply trust those in power, without evidence, without oversight, without limits, then we are no longer talking about defense. We are talking about control. Coming up next, we'll look at what history has to teach us, not just about Gladio, but about how to safeguard democracy from the very systems meant to protect it. So now that we've seen what happened, What do we learn from all this? Because the Gladio story isn't just a fascinating Cold War secret. It's a warning, a blueprint of what happens when unchecked power hides behind the curtain of national security. And if we want to avoid repeating this chapter of history, we need to understand what made it possible in the first place. Let's start with centralization. One of the key reasons Gladio operated in the shadows for so long was that decision-making and information were concentrated in the hands of a few. A small network of intelligence officials and foreign allies could design and deploy entire secret armies without public oversight. Why? Because they weren't accountable to local institutions. And in a centralized system, the fewer the people with knowledge, the easier it is to bury the truth. This is why decentralization matters. When power is distributed, it becomes harder to abuse. When local governments, independent investigators, and the public are part of the conversation, secrets become harder to hide. Central planning often promises efficiency, but it comes at the cost of visibility. The lesson of Gladio is that streamlined control is a double-edged sword. It may be faster, but it's also far easier to corrupt. And that leads us to transparency. Transparency isn't just a nice idea. It's a safeguard. When governments are open with their citizens, they build trust. But when they hide networks of violence behind the veil of secrecy, they create paranoia. And worse, sometimes they justify it. In a democracy, sunlight really is the best disinfectant, because when people know what's being done in their name, they can make informed choices. Without that, democracy becomes theater, a surface-level performance with no substance underneath. Civic vigilance also plays a role. It's easy to assume that liberty will just protect itself, that once a democracy is established, it'll naturally continue. But history tells us the opposite. Liberty must be defended actively, not just from foreign threats, but from domestic secrecy. When citizens stop asking questions, when journalists are silenced or dismissed, when institutions stop demanding accountability, that's when hidden networks flourish. Not because people are evil, but because systems without resistance grow in the dark. And finally, the big one. Gladio shows us that even well-intentioned strategies can have catastrophic effects when left unexamined. Defending a society should never come at the expense of its core values. Security is important, but it is not the same as freedom. When those two ideas are treated as interchangeable, we lose both. So what does this mean for us now? It means the tools we choose to build, whether they're laws, alliances, or intelligence agencies, must always come with limits, with checks, with questions. It means our defense should reflect our values, not compromise them. And it means the best way to protect democracy is to practice it. In our final slide, we'll bring everything together and reflect on what this story demands we remember. So what does the story of NATO's secret armies ultimately teach us? It teaches us that the greatest threat to democracy isn't always the enemy at the gates. Sometimes, it's the shadow behind the throne, the hidden hand, the decisions made in quiet rooms, without your vote, without your knowledge, and sometimes, without your safety in mind. Gladio began as a plan to resist tyranny, but in the shadows, it blurred the lines between protection and manipulation. And that's the part of history that often gets left out of the textbooks, not because it's irrelevant, but because it's uncomfortable. But here's the thing. History isn't just about what happened. It's about what keeps happening, when we forget, when we stop asking questions, when we trust blindly. This isn't ancient history. These networks operated during the lifetimes of millions alive today. And the playbook, covert action, strategic tension, centralized secrecy, still echoes in our world. In every surveillance program with no oversight. In every war waged without public debate. In every promise of security that quietly chips away at liberty. So what do we remember? We remember that power, when hidden, tends to grow, not responsibly, but recklessly. We remember that defense, if untethered from ethics, becomes indistinguishable from coercion. And we remember that real democracy requires more than elections. It requires awareness, participation, skepticism, and courage. If you found this story compelling, you'll definitely want to check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. You'll find the link in the description below, along with more resources to dig even deeper into these hidden chapters of the past. And if you enjoy history that challenges the official story, asks uncomfortable questions, and makes you think, make sure to like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. New content drops regularly, and trust me, we're just getting started. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and don't let the past be buried.